You were taught history as a single line. Hunter-gatherers, then farming, then cities, then us. One continuous climb, in one direction, with no repeats. That line is wrong. Not because of hidden continents or sunken islands with glowing giants. It's wrong because the real archaeological record is far stranger and far more thoroughly documented than most people ever get told. Actual civilizations, verified by excavation, writing, and radiocarbon dating, have risen and completely collapsed dozens of times throughout human history. So how many, really? And why does the honest number keep climbing every single decade? Here's the thing nobody tells you before we start. There's a version of this question that gets answered with lost continents like Atlantis, Mu, and a paradise called Hyperborea hiding under the Arctic ice. Those stories are genuinely fascinating, and we'll get to exactly why they refuse to die. But none of them have a single confirmed excavation, a single verified artifact, or a single piece of geological evidence that survives contact with actual scientific scrutiny. The real answer to how many civilizations Earth has had doesn't need any of that. The true record is already shocking enough on its own. So let's start with the pattern real archaeology has actually confirmed, because it's a pattern that repeats with almost eerie consistency. Around 2334 BCE, in Mesopotamia, a ruler named Sargon united the Sumerian city-states into what historians consider the world's first true multi-ethnic empire. Akkad. Cuneiform tablets describe an administration sophisticated enough to run a standardized system of governance across an enormous territory stretching from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. And then, within roughly a century, it collapsed. Modern climate researchers studying sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman found a sharp spike in dust deposits dating almost exactly to the Akkadian collapse, evidence of an abrupt, centuries-long drought that likely crippled the empire's agricultural base faster than its institutions could adapt. To this day, the location of Akkad's actual capital city has never been definitively found. That's not an isolated case. That's the first entry in a pattern that shows up again and again and again. Around 1900 BCE, the Indus Valley civilization, one of the largest urban cultures of the ancient world, spanning what is now Pakistan and northwest India, began abandoning its major cities. Sites like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa had featured grid-planned streets, standardized brick sizes, and covered drainage systems more advanced than anything Europe would build for another 3,000 years. Researchers studying the region's paleoclimate have identified a weakening of monsoon patterns around this period, likely disrupting the river systems the Indus cities depended on. Their script, remarkably, still hasn't been deciphered, an entire civilization, and we still can't read a word they wrote. Here's the thing nobody tells you about why these collapses keep surprising people who assume history only moves forward. Around 1200 BCE in the eastern Mediterranean, a cascade of collapses hit almost simultaneously. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, and several major cities along the Levantine coast, all within a few decades of each other. Archaeologists call this event the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the most studied mass civilizational failures in the historical record. Writing itself disappeared from Greece for roughly 300 years afterward, a stretch historians genuinely call the Greek Dark Age. Literacy, monumental architecture, and long-distance trade all collapsed together, and nobody has ever settled on one single cause. Drought, invasion by groups referred to only as the Sea Peoples, internal rebellion, and a cascading systems failure across interconnected trade networks have all been proposed. And the honest current answer among researchers is that it was probably several of these compounding at once. That's the wild part. This wasn't one civilization falling, it was an entire interconnected regional network collapsing in a domino effect. And the archaeological record shows the exact same domino pattern repeating on nearly every continent in eras that had zero contact with each other. Now, here's where it gets interesting again, because the pattern crosses the ocean without any help. Around 900 CE, in the Yucatan and the surrounding lowlands, the classic Maya civilization began a staged, uneven collapse. Cities like Tikal and Palenque, which had functioned as genuine metropolises housing tens of thousands of people, saw monumental construction halt mid-project. Researchers analyzing lake sediment cores from the region have documented a series of severe, prolonged droughts overlapping almost exactly with the timing of abandonment at major sites. The Maya themselves never fully disappeared. Contrary to the popular myth, millions of Maya people and their descendants live in the region today, but the specific political and urban system that built those cities did fail. Gradually, city by city, over roughly a century. Half a world away and centuries later, around 1300 CE, the great city-state of Cahokia, near modern St. Louis, was abandoned. At its peak, Cahokia was home to more people than London at the time, built around massive earthen mounds and a sophisticated understanding of astronomical alignment. alignment. Researchers have proposed flooding, resource depletion, and social upheaval as contributing factors. And like so many entries on this list, no single confirmed cause has been agreed upon. The people who built it left behind earthworks that still puzzle engineers about how they were organized without written records or draft animals. And in southern Africa, around the same general era, the stone city of Great Zimbabwe, home to as many as 18,000 people at its height, with dry stone walls built without any mortar, sophisticated enough that European colonizers initially, wrongly, refused to believe Africans had built it themselves, was gradually abandoned by around 1450 CE, likely due to a combination of overgrazing, resource exhaustion, and shifting trade routes as regional power moved elsewhere. There's an even earlier entry that arguably kicked off the entire pattern in the Mediterranean. Around 1600 BCE, the Minoan civilization on Crete, widely considered Europe's first advanced urban culture, complete with multi-story palaces, indoor plumbing, and vivid frescoes, was struck a devastating blow when the nearby volcanic island of Thera erupted in one of the largest volcanic events of the last 10,000 years. Ash layers from the eruption have been physically traced across the eastern Mediterranean seabed, and while Minoan culture didn't vanish overnight, the eruption's tsunamis and agricultural disruption likely crippled its naval trade networks badly enough that the Mycenaeans absorbed what remained within a few generations. Some researchers have even proposed the Thera eruption as a partial real-world seed for the Atlantis legend itself, an island culture destroyed suddenly by the sea, which is a far more evidence-backed candidate than anything involving a sunken continent in open ocean. And the pattern isn't confined to the ancient world at all. Around 1300 CE, the Nabataean kingdom, the desert traders who carved the spectacular city of Petra directly into sandstone cliffs and engineered a water collection system sophisticated enough to sustain a major city in the middle of an arid desert, faded from prominence after a combination of shifting Roman trade routes, earthquakes, and gradual desertification undercut the economic base their entire civilization depended on. And in Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire's capital at Angkor, at its height the largest pre-industrial urban settlement on the planet, complete with an engineered network of reservoirs and canals covering hundreds of square miles, was largely abandoned by the 15th century after researchers studying tree ring data identified a series of catastrophic monsoon failures, alternating brutal droughts with sudden severe flooding that overwhelmed the very water infrastructure that had made the city possible in the first place. Here's the thing, nobody tells you about why this keeps happening across completely disconnected cultures with no possible communication between them. Complex societies are, structurally, fragile in a very specific, predictable way. The more specialized and interdependent a civilization becomes, the more its food supply, governance, and trade all depend on every other part functioning correctly, the less resilient it becomes to a single serious shock. Anthropologist Joseph Tainter formalized this idea in his influential research on societal collapse, arguing that civilizations tend to solve their problems by adding complexity, and that complexity itself eventually produces diminishing returns until the system can no longer absorb the next crisis, whatever that crisis happens to be. That's not a coincidence. That's close to a law. So, given all of that documented, physically verified pattern, why do stories like Atlantis, Mu, and Hyperborea persist so stubbornly in popular imagination? Because the actual answer is almost more interesting than the myths themselves. Plato introduced Atlantis in two dialogues around 360 BCE, and modern classical scholars overwhelmingly read it as a deliberate philosophical allegory about hubris and the fall of overreaching societies, not a historical claim. Hyperborea, similarly described in fragments by Herodotus and others, functioned in ancient Greek thought as a symbolic paradise at the edge of the known world, the kind of place every ancient culture imagined existing just past the border of their maps. And Mu was a wholesale 20th century invention, built almost entirely from one writer's unverifiable claim to have seen ancient tablets nobody else was ever shown. None of these stories have produced a single confirmed excavation, not one. Even the supposed modern evidence people point to, for Atlantis specifically, orichalcum ingots recovered from a Mediterranean shipwreck, submerged stone formations off the Spanish coast, turn out on closer inspection to be either misidentified natural geology or artifacts from entirely different, well-documented ancient cultures with no connection to Plato's story whatsoever. Compare that to Akkad, the Indus Valley, the late Bronze Age states, the Maya, Cahokia, Great Zimbabwe, the Minoans, the Nabataeans, and the Khmer. Every single one backed by physical cities, physical artifacts, and in most cases, actual written records confirming their existence, and often their downfall in remarkable detail. That contrast is really the whole point. A legend needs a good story and a receptive audience to survive for thousands of years. A real lost civilization needs something far harder to fake, a city you can actually walk into, walls you can actually carbon date, and, ideally, a written record left behind by the very people who watched their own world end. So here's the actual answer to the shocking count. Depending on how strictly you define civilization, a genuinely complex, urbanized, hierarchical society with monumental architecture and centralized governance, mainstream archaeology has confirmed dozens of them across human history that fit that description and subsequently collapsed or fundamentally transformed. Not 12, not mythical, dozens, verified. And the number keeps rising with every new excavation, satellite survey, and LiDAR scan through dense jungle canopy that reveals cities historians didn't even know to look for. That's the actual shocking part. You don't need a sunken continent to be unsettled by how many times human civilization has already ended. You just need the honest archaeological record, which shows that collapse isn't the exception in human history. It's closer to the rule, repeating itself independently on every inhabited continent throughout the entire span of recorded time. So picture the pattern one more time. A city rises, sophisticated enough to organize thousands of people, precise enough to track the stars, resilient enough to last for centuries. And then, somewhere between a drought, an earthquake, an invasion, and the simple accumulating weight of its own complexity, it ends. Sometimes suddenly. More often, slowly enough that nobody inside it even realized they were watching the end happen. And somewhere else on the planet, often with zero knowledge that the last one ever existed, another one begins to rise, making exactly the same climb all over again. Right up until the archaeologists working today, deploying LiDAR over jungle canopy and satellite radar over desert sand, keep finding the outlines of yet another one nobody had written down at all.